Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers, sisters, and friends. My name is Dr. Salman Butt, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to another episode of this new program that we've started on Istiqlal TV, the voice of Istiqlal. We have with us today a very special guest all the way from Ithaca, upstate New York, and that is Professor Magnus Fiskesjö. He's the associate professor at Cornell University, and he specializes in archaeology and anthropology, and he's been studying Far Eastern cultures and Southeast Asia for many years, and will be talking to us today on this program. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
The Voice of Istiqlal, this program, it's an opportunity for us to, in the English-speaking world, to become privy to conversations that are happening about the Uyghurs in particular, and generally about the problems that are happening to minorities in China, and in particular East Turkistan, so-called Xinjiang province. And your research has been you've been researching this topic for many years, and I just wanted to maybe open up with a general question. Because I looked at some of your publications and I thought, in your opinion, what would you say are some of the similarities and differences between China's, what many people call colonialism today, and Western colonialism of the past?
Well, thank you. I think it's a very good question because it's often overlooked. Many people forget that they are essentially the same. And I often get the sense that many people think that colonialism means British colonialism, Spanism. Unfortunately, colonialism with imperialism has been with us for centuries, if not millennia. And the basics are not surprising. It's about conquering other people. That's how you build an empire. It's about sending in settlers to take over the conquered territories and ruling them, and to drown out surviving local people and indigenous people. So in that sense, Chinese colonialism is similar to what other imperial powers have been doing in history. Of course, there's also some differences. One that stands out is, if you think of the British, that was very much, a sea empire ruling the seas, and China, above all, has been a land empire, more like Russia, and this is one difference. There are also some difference in how this colonialism, this imperialism, has been justified in China. The language of that is special in some ways, because it turns on this idea that China is the civilization by less worthy barbarians who in the Chinese imagination serve as a kind of an opposite number of the civilized, sort of justifying their existence. You can point to them and say that they are the barbarians, and that proves how civilized we are over here. And to go with that, they developed this notion historically that the barbarians better be grateful that they're conquered, because that means they're lifted up and helped. And so throughout Chinese history, as the Chinese empires have come and gone and been reestablished, there's been this idea that the barbarians are submitting willingly and happily, with love, to be ruled by the Chinese empire, because that brings benefits. Of course, this is a story that the Chinese in history have told themselves to justify the conquest that they have been carrying out. But that, you can also say, there's a very peculiar kind of Chinese discourse there. Again, it's similar to some of the ways in which, for example, the British would say, "Oh, we brought civilization to India," or something like that.
Railroads.
And that is railroads, yes.
Yeah.
Not to forget the railroad. Yes.
Yeah. So ultimately, you're saying there's a similar impetus which is motivating the desire to dominate more and more people, desire to bring more and more lands under the control of the motherland, so to speak. Do you see any?
Even today, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. Carry on.
No, I was going to say that even today, the main slogan at the core of the pronouncement of the Chinese state is wealth and power, and that is basically what the empires were after, and it's again now what the contemporary Chinese state is after. So it is about it is similar to other instances in history of colonialism, in that you go in, you take over the natural resources that exist in that area that you're targeting. You're not going there for nothing. You're going there to take those things and appropriate those things. And of course, in the case of East Turkistan, or Xinjiang in Chinese, it's about the oil, it's about the mining resources, it's about the agriculture, it's about other things that can be found there, and that they are taking over.
So, in your opinion, what are some of the key differences then between Western colonialism and what's happening to the Uyghurs in East Turkestan?
Well, I would argue that the similarities outweigh the differences. There are some ways in which this is done, this is justified in a peculiar Chinese way. We see today a carryover from the imperial times, that the Chinese government is talking about development as a gift to the underdeveloped peoples of those areas that they are conquering and taking over and exploiting, and that's kind of justification is similar, but in a fundamental sense, I would say that it is the same. There is a tricky history. I can say a few words about this. China was formally an empire until 1911-12, and I think you can say that, and I've written about this, you can say that since that time, the Chinese have been struggling with what to do with the legacy of this empire. Are we going to continue to be something like an empire that is dominating people who don't want to be dominated, just because they ended up on the map of the empire of the past? Or are we going to set them free and let them go? Which way is it going to be? So right after they overthrew the empire, which was run by the Manchu aristocracy from the Manchu people originally in the northeast of China, but who ruled the empire, who took over the machinery of the empire, and then ruled it together with all the Chinese and everybody else for a couple hundred years. After that, there was these debates among the successful Chinese revolutionaries. What do we do now? And they ended up with a kind of a compromise, acknowledging the existence of 5 different people in China. There were people already at that time who said we should not do that. We should not recognize anybody else. We should be like those Western countries, one people, one nation, and maybe one Führer or one leader. We should be. They also had Japan as a model. In Japan lived the Japanese, nobody else. Already then wasn't true. But this is the nation state idealized in contemporary and the recent European of each having one people, which was of course a false ideal, but there was lots of people in China who felt that we should have that, so we should not recognize those Tibetans and Uyghurs and what have you. We should force them to just be Chinese and nothing else. And they tried to do it. Sun Yat-sen, who was one of the foremost leaders there in the 20s, he succeeded in making China drop the 5-color flag that recognized 5 minorities, if you wish, or 5 peoples, and replace it with would imply a unified citizenship. It's very interesting that he himself seems like a kind of a forerunner. You mentioned railroads, and at the same time, he was proposing these massive schemes that it seems China is carrying out today. Those schemes, railroads cutting through East Turkestan, going to Europe through Central Asia. Those were his ideas, and he tried to get investment from the West. And in the 1920s, when he was trying to justify this to America, to Britain, and to those other people, nations that he sent this to, he was saying that very openly that we want to be like Western colonialism, building railroads in order to appropriate and settle with our own people those areas that will take over. We want to use the railroad in the same way. So he was, at the same time that he presented himself as a proponent of this unified nation that would not recognize minorities, he was also proposing a new version of the imperialism, but under the aegis of a nation state and not the empire that he had just overthrown. And then the communists came around, and that is very interesting. In the 1930s, they were the opposition. They were struggling to take over China from the nationalist government that existed then. And so, to be different, they said that when we come to power, we'll allow everybody to split off and form their own nations. Those people who were oppressed and conquered and oppressed by the empire in the past, such as the Uyghurs, such as the Tibetans, such as the Miao, and so on. They wrote this into their party constitution. They can, if they so wish, they can go off and establish their own countries. They actually made a promise like that. It's very embarrassing now when you bring this up with Chinese scholars or Chinese officials. They have trouble handling this because they did make that promise. And then they took it back in 1949. They established something like the Soviet system of a limited autonomy on paper, a nominal autonomy, such as happened in East Turkestan, where this nation state that the Uyghurs set up for themselves twice in the 20th century, that was cancelled out, and instead they got this Soviet-style idea of nominal autonomy for this region. And that's the system they have kept until now. What I feel now today is that they're going back to this idea of erasing every identity except the Chinese. Then now it seems that they want, with eyes on global domination, they have an idea that we can't afford any difference. We can't tolerate anybody be different in China. We have to erase all those differences so that there's only a unified China that can sort of stand up
Chinese identity
to the world. That seems. Sorry.
Do you think they have their sights set further afield for domination, or are they trying to kind of fortify what's within their existing borders?
Yeah. Well, I think they definitely have their eyes set further afield, and you can get this just from official Chinese pronouncements. The way they will talk about this, of course, is not, they won't acknowledge it straight off, but they'll say things that China ought to recuperate its rightful place in the world as a powerful center. That's how they will talk about it. And the interesting thing is also, there too, you can see how, whereas the communists originally made a name for themselves by presenting themselves as against empire, against the Chinese empire and against other empires too, British and what have you, they tried to portray themselves as offering independence for those that had been conquered, such as the Uyghurs. Then they took that back in 1949. What they're doing now, actually, as they have given up on a lot of the specifically communist or Marxist-Leninist, Maoist kind of rhetoric that dominated in the past and under Mao Zedong, they have scrapped that, and instead they're embracing China's identity with the empire. So it's really a total turnaround. In the past, they would criticize empires not only for conquering others, but also for oppressing the Chinese people at home. That's also forgotten now. Now, what Chinese students learn in school is that the empires were glorious, and that there is a continuity between us and the empire. So Chinese school children don't learn anything about all the blood spilled in all those conquests. They're presented with a picture where there's really no explanation for why is China as big as it is, which is of course because they conquered those places. You know, they sent armies to conquer those places. That's why it has the size that it has. No, instead, school children are told that this is somehow a natural thing, that all those people that are on that map today, they belong there somehow naturally, mystically. There's no explanation, and so school children don't learn about this. They never hear about this. They will only ever hear about China as the victim of somebody else's colonialism, but never about the colonialism they have perpetrated themselves.
I guess that's another thing that we have in common in Western states. Then it's quite rare for children, even in the United Kingdom, for example, to ever hear about anything remotely, you know, accurate about the British Empire, and you know, until maybe A levels or university level. And I suppose, I mean, I didn't know that about China in terms of the Chinese Communist Party, their drastic change in kind of attitude towards empire and minorities' rights and so forth. But I guess if you have such a tight control on education and knowledge production, then you can rewrite the script relatively easily, and people will just begin to, I guess, forget what their grandmothers used to learn. Speaking about kind of identity and disappearing identities, you've published a book about China's colonization of the Wa people, and this was a you know, a nation that I didn't really know much about. I was wondering if you could just briefly, I guess, introduce who the Wa people were and what happened to them, and how this is relevant to our current discussion and policy with regards to East Turkistan and the Uyghurs.
Yes, absolutely. So I should say that the Wa people are much smaller people than the Uyghurs. They are about 1 million, and because there's a border drawn straight through their old territory, they are now split on two countries, Burma and China. One other very striking difference with East Turkestan and Uyghurs is that the Wa people never had a state like that set up by in East Turkestan, and so quite different from both East Turkestan and also from Tibet and Mongolia, which are those other places around the Chinese Empire where the locals set up new states after the demise of the empire in 1911, states that could fit into the modern nation-state system that originated in Europe and which still dominates today. Everybody's supposed to be a nation. Now Mongolia succeeded in establishing itself as an independent country. Tibet could not, tried, and East Turkestan could not, but they have this history of setting up what very much looked like contemporary modern states of Europe or anywhere. And in contrast with the Wa people never had a government. This was a very different political situation there. They were independent, but they did not have a king, they did not have a government, they did not have a president or anything. Instead, it was every locality for itself, and if there was an external enemy, they would join in a fight against them. And they projected this image of themselves as being very scary. They're famous for as headhunters, and that worked to an extent that outsiders were very wary about going into the area because they thought these people are going to cut our heads off, and that did happen. So you can think of them as a politically very different kind of place that didn't have anything like an army, a government, a currency, or a formalized religion. They had something like their own religion, but the form of any of these things was nothing like that much more formal setup that existed in those other places. So it's quite distinct. And what I've written about is this history of this kind of political organization. How did it really work? How did they manage to preserve their own autonomy and wealth? They were able to live quite well. And when the British tried to conquer them from Burma and incorporate them into the Burma-India Empire, they sent scouts, and they were shocked. Like everybody else along the periphery here are poor, and people are far and few between. And what's going on with these Wa people? This place is so densely populated. You know, the women have this silver and gold adornments and jewelry, and so where's all the money coming from? And this is because they were managing themselves, and they also exported opium, which had something to do with it. So it's in several ways it's a place that's distinct and different from those other places that set up their own countries and that have this political tradition that was not in place in the Wa area. What's similar is that since the 1950s, there's been a similar kind of development. Chinese settlers coming into the area, taking over. Everything is framed in terms of development as a gift to the Wa, when in practice, as I have observed, it has meant the reduction of the Wa people from the owners and users of the land to a kind of a peasant, often working for plantations, working for Chinese businesses, agroforestry, and so on. So they have become much more like you go around the world, you can find many places where people are on the periphery of economic centers. They are the target of economic extraction. They're not in charge of themselves. They are a kind of a peasant periphery. That's what the Wa have become today.
And do you think that whilst that is the case in terms of them becoming kind of targets for economic extraction and moving lower down the, maybe, I guess, socioeconomic ladder, would you say their identity is still intact, or have there been attempts to assimilate them and remove aspects that made them different or distinct from Han Chinese?
Yes, indeed, there have. So, for example, when they were still, the Wa people were still independent, they used to have these communal rituals and other means by which they sort of forged their identity so that they could stand together in the way that they did. That's all been forbidden. A lot of it centered around these drum shrines that they had. Those drums have all been burned. You nowadays see them only at theme parks and museums, and nobody's using them the way autonomous Wa society used them in the past, sort of as the ground zero of their independence. And they have been, of course, through schooling, they have now been told for decades that they are inferior, underdeveloped, less worthy minorities who ought to be grateful for the help that they're getting from the Chinese state to develop and fit into the big picture. Lots and lots of them have also now, like many other rural Chinese, been sucked into this migrant worker tsunami of people from poorer areas that have gone out to help build the wealth of Eastern China in construction and in factories and so on. So there's also a kind of although they after Mao died, they sort of regained some of their freedom to define themselves, and some of their culture was revived, which I write about. I happened to be there at that time, and there was a lot invested in this. But this whole economic onslaught of the migrant worker situation, it has meant a kind of a break with that cultural transmission that did exist for some time. It's very difficult to continue as a people when the strong and able-bodied young people are gone. And that's a parallel actually to the Uyghur situation, because we're noticing how they are sending, and I've written a paper about the situation of Uyghur women in the genocide together with Rukia Turdush in the Journal of Genocide Studies, and we wrote about it also, how they are force sending Uyghur young women to factory work in eastern China, and they're separate from the young men who go to different places, or they go to prisons, or worse. And of course, that in itself, that kind of separation in itself, is probably also intentionally to ensure that there will be no new young families, because these people can't meet. You take an entire generation and send them separately to work in different places, and then you encourage them, the girls, to go and get married to Chinese men instead. There's a huge impetus for that because of the gender discrepancy in China. There are millions of men who would like nothing more than finding a wife, and so there is a market. There's a market for this, and quite a few ethnic minority women in China, they become the spouses of rural Chinese who have no other prospect of finding.
Is that because of the one-child policy?
In the past, yes, because people got rid of their girls and aborted them, and that's created a huge gender gap. That's one part of the reason why there's this almost a magnetic force pulling girls away. I mean, now if we talk about the Uyghurs who are sent east to work in factories and to be isolated from men and women of their own kind, that's a government initiative. That's a government program. So that's what I'm talking about in this mountain areas of the Wa people of southwest China. There, it's not organized by government recruiters. You know, they don't have a train packed up with people sending them off to eastern China. It's more a constant trickle of every village seeing young people go away because they have this hope of a better economic future if they go work in those factories in southern China, eastern China. But in the case of the Uyghurs, I see this as actually a conscious, intentional part of the genocide, to remove this next generation of young parents and make sure that they don't become parents.
I mean, China projects itself as China itself, and also its allies, you know, heads of state of other states around the world that are, you know, allies to China. They project themselves as, you know, at the cusp of this successful program of lifting millions and hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and into, you know, some kind of positive economic direction. But what you've described about the Wa people is that they actually did the opposite. They've taken people who are economically, at least, by all intents and purposes, a thriving, successful nation, and they've drawn them down into poverty.
Yes,
is that
exactly. And I think this goes back to how exploitation is often justified with very pretty words. I come to think of the many, you know, slaveholders in the United States of America who argued that slavery is good for the slaves, and they meant it. You know, that's how they would justify saying that they get such a good they get taken care of. They good exercise and food and so on, and in that case, it's easy to see through that this is a justification, a self-serving justification on the side of the slaveholders. But I think that we should regard, the Chinese government's justification of these forced labor schemes that they have been putting into practice with the Uyghurs, shipping them from their homeland to eastern China. We should regard that with equal suspicion. There's been lots of reports on how people actually don't want to go. If they're presented with a choice, they might not go. They wouldn't want to go, and so that flies in the face of how the government is presenting this as, almost in this classical imperial Chinese manner, that the barbarians are grateful for getting lifted up to civilization by what we do to them, which is a self-serving justification that I see replicated today.
It's quite chilling indeed. If you're just joining us, brothers and sisters, we're on the program called The Voice of Istiqlal. Our aim here is to open up conversations on the Uyghur issue with Uyghurs themselves. We invite Uyghurs themselves and also scholars that are working in the field of anthropology, in sociology, in Middle Eastern Far Eastern politics and so forth. And we have with us Associate Professor from Cornell University, Professor Magnus Fiskesjö, and we're talking about Chinese colonialism, comparing it to the colonization of the Uyghur people and their near assimilation and near disappearance as a people. And Professor Magnus, I wanted to ask you then, we've spoken about the Uyghur people and the similarities between what's happened to them and what's happening to the Uyghurs in East Turkestan. Do you think that Uyghurs therefore will actually disappear?
Well, it does seem that is the ultimate goal of these Chinese government policies that are afoot now. I really think that the combined effect of all of these things, the forced labor schemes, starting with the concentration camps for so-called re-education, where you denounce yourself, denounce your religion, and also are prohibited from speaking your own language and so on. That and the forced labor schemes, and that combined with all sorts of attacks and assaults on heritage, cultural and religious heritage, and assault on language, so that children are not allowed to speak their own language in school and so on. I do think that taken together, this is genocide, and the intent of it is to eradicate the Uyghurs as a people. And I think that they have dug in to try to accomplish this over multiple years. The genocide has been going now for 5 years, and I think that they probably count it as a partial success so far. They, of course, do know that we've seen something similar in the past, in Mao's times, in the 1960s, 70s. There was also a very harsh policy against both religion and cultural identity in East Turkestan. And once that was halted, it created an appearance of uniformity. But once it was halted, people were able to bounce back. They were able to rely on memory of their history and of their culture to rebuild and reconstitute themselves. And I think this, just as under Mao, this to be the hope right now also, that there will be such a change again, in China, that they give up on this intolerant attitude that they have now, and halt these schemes which actually destroy unwarranted, destroy the culture of somebody else in their homeland.
I've learned a lot in this conversation. I thank you very much for joining us. But I just wanted to ask you one question to wrap up. And it's a question I always ask myself, and I ask different people and guests that we have, and that is, in your opinion, why do you think China is so scared of having diversity and different peoples within its borders? practicing their faith, living their lives, expressing their own cultural identity?
It's a difficult question, and I also spend a lot of time thinking about why is it that they have to do this, and why would they be so intolerant? Why not choose tolerance? Some of my colleagues would point back to the several decades of 1950s onwards, when China, the Chinese government did acknowledge a diversity in a formal sense, the national ethnic minorities, 54 of them. This was 55 of them. This was a system. It is true. It was a system that formally recognized that these people do exist, even though at the same time assimilation, lots of measures making people assimilate, and having a law that there should be bilingual education, then not following it, and Chinese officials are refusing to learn local languages, etc. All of this was going on for decades. But now we see this dramatic shift in the direction of a much sharper intolerance, even genocidal policies that seem designed to destroy that difference and diversity. And so it does become a question: what happened? And I think that the answer is probably that it's no accident that at the same time we see this shift towards intolerance, to diversity, to ethnic cultural diversity and religious diversity. At the same time, we see a sharpening of the ideological control of the Chinese people themselves. So it is as if the more China becomes itself dictatorial to its own people and intolerant of dissent and diversity of viewpoints among its own people, Chinese people, at the same time, the more likely they will be to develop this sort of intolerance against ethnic others. I think these two things go together, and I think I've been reinforced in this thinking by watching Russia and Ukraine, because there too it seems that the issue is about tolerance. Mr. Putin doesn't want to tolerate Ukraine as a separate country, even though it is, it even is an internationally recognized modern nation state, and still he is out to eradicate it. And he's doing that at the same time that he's cracking down on his own Russian people. Russian people are not allowed to have a diversity of opinions, to publish a newspaper. He's shutting down radio stations. People are writing about how now Russia is looking more and more like China in terms of the intolerance to a diversity of opinions. So and listening to what people are saying about that correlation between intolerance at home against the majority population and the intolerance against minorities and against ethnic diversity. I think that this applies to China definitely, and I'm encouraged by some signs in China that there are many Chinese people who don't want to suffer this anymore, and who are also very much against this, and who would like to see to return to something like a tolerance that of other people existing and actually being different.
Okay, on that somewhat positive and hopeful note, I guess we can end it there. Sorry to take so much of your time, but it was a pleasure speaking to you. That was Professor Magnus Fiskesjö from Cornell University. I hope to speak to you soon in the future, hopefully. And thank you very much for joining us, Professor. And thank you at home for watching.
So much.
This has been The Voice of Istiqlal, a new program that we're doing on Istiqlal TV, opening up conversations about the Uyghur issue in the English-speaking world, where we invite Uyghurs themselves, prominent Uyghur leaders, activists, academics, as well as scholars from around the world that are studying the Uyghurs and topics related to the Uyghurs. I've been your host, Dr. Salman Butt, and until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.